Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. It's terrific to be with you all in this beautiful city. So you don't need me to tell you what an enormous problem this is. There's nobody better qualified to know the cost of dementia than the people in this room, a cost that is felt most keenly, of course, by the people with the disease themselves and by their families. But nonetheless, it is an enormous financial cost as well. And notwithstanding some of the glimmers of hope for a therapy that actually affects the disease itself that Bengt has told us about this morning, the story over the past 5 years or so has actually been a story of failure. Serial trials failure that are enormously costly in financial terms. These two studies were reported last year. These are the studies that Professor Wimplatt referred to, and I understand that the cost of these two studies, which are essentially failed trials, was something over 2 billion euros. It's a huge amount of money. Not even the enormously wealthy pharmaceutical industry can afford to do this very often, and there is a tangible prospect of the pharmaceutical industry leaving this field if we don't have some successes soon. And that would be enormously damaging, not only for yourselves, for people with dementia today, but most importantly, for generations to come. So why did these trials fail? Well, I think that there might be a number of reasons. The first is there is too little being done. So, as Professor Wimplatt has explained to us, most of the studies on drugs for the disease itself, rather than symptomatic treatments, are focused on amyloid. There has been too little diversification in the field. Too many research groups in industry and academia are going after the same target. The trials are done too late in the disease. As Florence has just told us, there is a 10, perhaps 20-year period before the disease is clinically symptomatic, when it is beginning to affect the brain. It's probably too much to ask of a therapy to begin to reverse 20 years of damage. And these trials are all done in symptomatic people of one sort or another. But most importantly, these trials were done in the wrong people. I mean, it's extraordinary, really, but these are trials that are done targeting the amyloid deposition in the brain, and it turned out that something like 20% or even more of the people that were included in these clinical trials actually didn't have amyloid in their brain. So to be honest, if you're giving a drug to people 20 years after the disease has started, if in fact they have that actual disease in their brain, it's no great surprise if the drugs don't work. We need to do something different. So what do we need to do? Well, it's quite simple. It's quite simple to do the PowerPoint slide anyway. All we need to do is to come up with different kinds of targets. Diversify our target development, to use the sort of technical terms. We need to do trials in prodromal or preclinical disease. You've heard this morning already that we're developing means to diagnose Alzheimer's disease ever earlier. But also, and most importantly, I think we need to fail quicker. Now, I think Bengt referred to this briefly. Trials at the moment go on too long. So they go through this phase 1, first in man, to phase 2, proof of concept, through to phase 3, which means efficacy trials, and they go through to phase 3 too quickly before we really proved the concept that this was a good idea. And that's when the costs get incurred, and more importantly, that's when large numbers of people get exposed to drug, potentially unnecessarily, when there could be better drugs in development. So we need to fail trials quicker in order to make progress more rapidly. So I'm going to briefly tell you this morning about some platforms for research that have been established in Europe. And I think as Europeans we can be rather proud that we are now leading the field. There is no question that these platforms are changing the face of Alzheimer's disease research. And our friends on the other side of the Atlantic and elsewhere in the world are, to be honest, playing catch-up with us. And that's quite a nice position to be in. I'm not going to have time to tell you about the diversification of target development that's happening in the UK, but I will tell you a little bit about the other three platforms, Dementia's Platform UK and two large trans-European programs called EMIF and EPAD, and I'll tell you what those things mean. The bottom line, the financial bottom line, is there's something over 200 million euros that has been invested in a 5-year period on these 4 programs of research. So this is a graph that you see very often at these kind of conferences, and this, as we know, is the decline of Alzheimer's disease. And where we currently do most clinical trials is when people actually have dementia. Historically, that's when the majority of trials have been done, and this is called symptomatic therapy. For a biologist or for somebody who's interested in the disease, actually, it's probably palliative therapy. It's end stage of a long process. And what we actually need to do is to do treatments earlier. Now, here's a term, secondary prevention, that you may or may not have heard of. If we could have a therapy that worked in that stage when the disease is affecting the brain, but before there are actual symptoms, and it prevented the progression of the disease so that the person never experienced symptoms, that would be a kind of preventative therapy. It's called secondary prevention, and it's slightly different from the kind of prevention that Professor Wimblett talked about, which could take place much, much earlier in life to mitigate the risk symptoms. So secondary prevention is most likely to take place in people in their late 50s through to their late 60s, and maybe even later, before they have symptoms, but when they have the clinical disease. But how do you know who to treat in a secondary prevention? They don't have symptoms by definition, and so the only way that you could possibly know who to treat is by having markers, some kind of biomarker of the disease process. And there are 2 kinds of biomarkers we need for these clinical trials. One, to help us to select the right people to go into the clinical trials, sometimes called a stratification marker, and another kind of biomarker to measure whether the drug is working or not, to measure whether the person is progressing when you can't measure that by cognitive symptoms or some other symptoms of the disease. So the first of the platforms that I want to talk about, the Dementia's Platform UK, is, I think, going to help us a little bit, I hope, to find those markers, especially markers for selection. Now, this is an enormous study. It's a study which is reutilizing or repurposing existing studies. There are many cohorts that have been established, cohorts to track all sorts of diseases, and we have them in the UK, just as you have them here in Slovenia, and there are many others all over Europe. Often, these are set up for some other reason, or just to track health in a population. Can we bring those cohorts together and repurpose them to make them of benefit for research in Alzheimer's disease? Well, we're beginning to do that in the UK. And the cohort that we're repurposing the most is called UK Biobank. I'll just tell you a little bit about UK Biobank. I think it's the world's largest volunteer program for health that's been established. Now, people were selected at random in the UK, 500,000 of them. As it happens, I was selected at random, so I'm a participant, a research participant in UK Biobank, and I've experienced the intense phenotyping or assessment that took place about 5 or 8 years ago. And I, like 500,000 of my fellow citizens in the UK, gave all sorts of fluids and samples, and every so often I get an email asking me to participate in another aspect of this study. Now, about 100,000 of us, and slightly more in fact, have had web-based cognitive testing. So I had my cognitive test just before Christmas, And those of you that work in the field of psychology will know that there's a real problem with cognitive tests, that it's hard to find one that is good for the whole population. So it's hard to find one that works really well for people that have had a limited education and perhaps are in the early stages of disease, to other people who've had an extensive education and don't have disease. I've got 4 degrees. I obviously thought that I'm going to be in the ceiling. It's not going to work for me, this cognitive test. Let me share a little secret with you. I was so confident that I thought it would be good for my daughters to see just how good I was. So I got one of them to come in while I was doing my cognitive testing. It took about 3 minutes for me to ask her to leave the room. All I can say is, if there is a ceiling in this test, I didn't reach it. But as well as these amazing kind of things, currently we're doing whole body imaging in people, and that's going to extend to 100,000 people over the next few years. Just this week, I believe, the pilot results were released, openly accessed to the scientific community, and something like 5,000 people have had whole body imaging in the pilot study. So to give you an idea of scale, the biggest rival study in the world is something in the region of 1,000 subjects or participants. The pilot of UK Biobank is 5 times bigger than that, and eventually 100,000 people will have brain imaging. 10,000 of those people will have repeat brain imaging, repeat cognition measures, repeat blood samples, and we'll be able to track them to see when, if and when they get dementia. That's a very broad study. We're also doing a very deep study. So in a study that we're doing, we're trying to take every single biomarker that every scientist has ever imagined and give them to a group of people, not just once, but more or less every 2 months. It's an enormously taxing study for research participants. Because it's so taxing, so many investigations, including repeated lumbar puncture, repeated brain scans, EEGs, and so on, we were asked to do a feasibility and acceptability study first. Would research participants agree, and would they actually have all these measures? The scientific referees thought that they wouldn't. You may not be surprised to know that, of course, they did. People, I think, as Florence has already said, amazingly generous with their time and effort, and have willingly participated and hardly missed a single assessment. So I hope that we'll move to the full study next year when we'll do all of these kind of measures repeatedly. Let me tell you now about the next of the platforms, EMIF. This stands for the European Medical Information Framework. And it's doing now across the whole of Europe what Dementia's Platform UK has done in my country. It's bringing together existing cohorts and accessing large amounts of pre-existing data for dementia research. And it's a public-private consortia. So this is a new way of doing research. The pharmaceutical industry realizes this is very difficult. It's so difficult to research Alzheimer's disease, effectively, that it's better for us to work together. And so we are working together, and it's public-private, because part of the funding comes from the EU, part from industry, and it's public also in the sense that we are sharing our data very widely indeed. So what have we done? So the first thing that we've done is we've established a catalogue of cohorts across Europe, and this is going to expand over the next few years. It's the most important thing you can do. If you don't know what's out there already, you can't do research with it. You can't find those collaborations. And so this is set up to help those collaborative efforts across Europe. And then we're bringing together in our catalogue many different cohorts from all over Europe, and already you can see that we have substantial amounts of data. So if you look through the catalogue, you can find that there are, in relation to pre-Alzheimer's disease, something over 50,000 people. people without any kind of dementia, people with subjective cognitive impairment, people with mild cognitive impairment, and researchers can request to access that data. If you want blood samples, you can find large numbers of blood samples. If you want to find even the more complicated measures, like if you want PET scans, you can find substantial numbers of PET scans on these people that researchers in the consortium can begin then to access and analyze. But the really big numbers come from electronic medical records. So most of the information related to health is not in research databases, but is in databases that your doctor collects, the routine care that you receive from your family doctor or specialists. Now this is no longer recorded in pencil and paper for the most part, but on a computer. Theoretically, it might be accessible for research. So we've established a system that is beginning to explore how best to do this, and through EMIF we can now identify something like 50 million European electronic medical records and begin to use these for research. So what kind of research can we do from this kind of data? Well, here's a study that we're currently doing. We know that inflammation is related to Alzheimer's disease, and we know that non-steroidal anti-inflammatories reduce your risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. But what about the diseases of inflammation? Do they alter your risk? What about the other anti-inflammatory drugs? Do they reduce your risk? What about the genetic variants related to inflammation? Do they mitigate these risks one way or another? We can begin to explore this through these enormous data sets that EMIF has established. The final of the cohort, these big studies that I want to tell you about, is the European Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease, the most ambitious of these four platforms that we've established. So the core of the European Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease is an adaptive clinical trial. So an adaptive clinical trial is a trial that potentially ends quicker than a normal clinical trial. So it's a trial where you can give a drug, and instead of the end point being what we're all interested in, cognition or the onset of dementia, you might stop the trial earlier by using a biomarker. This is an approach that was pioneered in the field of breast cancer. If I can take a minute just to explain the process, because it is a little complicated. In breast cancer, typically if you have breast cancer, you have a mastectomy and then you have chemotherapy. And what some researchers from the US realized, I'm going to caricature their trial now, it's not quite as simple as this, but more or less what they realized. If you reversed the order, you might get an idea about whether the chemotherapy is working. That is, if you give the chemotherapy before you do the surgery, then when you actually do the surgery, maybe some weeks or months later, you can look at the tissue that you've removed from the mastectomy and see whether the chemotherapy is beginning to work. Once they had that idea, they then had another idea. Well, why do we just compare one drug to a placebo? Why don't we compare lots of different chemotherapies to a placebo? And that way we would have an idea about which of the chemotherapies was most effective. And this is the process of an adaptive clinical trial. It changes the randomization halfway through. A way of caricaturing it is it's a trial that picks the winner or increases your likelihood of doing so. So this is what we're going to do in the European Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease. This is the typical clinical trial where we compare a placebo to a single treatment. Instead of doing that, we're going to compare a placebo to a whole different range of treatments. That means if you're a participant in the clinical trial, you actually have a much better chance of being on an active treatment than you do of being on a placebo. And then at some intermediate point, we will measure whether the drugs seem to be working against a biomarker. So that biomarker might be a PET scan, for example. And based on that, some of the treatments are likely not to work, and they will drop out, and the people that were taking that treatment get re-randomized now to a treatment that looks as if it might be working. We don't know yet, but it's working on the biomarker at least. And then we move on to an outcome that really matters to you and me, and of course to people with dementia, and that is a cognition outcome, and we could adapt again. So this is the plan for EPAD, but in order to make EPAD work, we need to do a number of things. First of all, we need to have a cohort of people that we will have ready to go for a clinical trial, speed up the process of recruitment. In order to establish that cohort of people, we need to have a registry of people willing to participate in clinical trials that have already got some data collected. In order to establish that registry, we're going to bring together existing cohorts. So the first part of this we can do through the EMIF study I've just told you about. Over the next 6 months or so, we'll set up a registry of 24,000 people across Europe. From that, we'll enhance the information we have on those people to form a readiness cohort of 6,000 people. And then we'll do a clinical trial in 1,500 people. And we won't do this just once. We will do it again and again and again. And the intent is this will be a rolling clinical trial, and we will keep going until the job is done. And the amazing thing is we have the commitment of our pharmaceutical industry partners, some of whom are in the room, to continue to fund this trial until we make substantial progress. So if you want to hear more about the European Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease trial, I want to tell you about a session today at 1 o'clock, which is led by Jean-Georges, where some of my colleagues and I will be talking a little bit more about the EPAD, and we will have some time to engage with you and to have some discussion in that session. So I want to thank my leads and co-leads for these 4 platforms. It's been an enormously exciting 18 months setting up these platforms, but I especially want to thank the large numbers that are involved in these studies, from the 50 or so people that are on the executive committees alone, 150 or more principal investigators, most importantly the more than 50,000 volunteers in the studies, the 200 million, I've missed out 3 zeros there, of euros. I mean, we're cheap, but we're not that cheap, that we've had from our funders, but most importantly, to the 50 million or so people that have contributed data one way or another to these studies, and thank you for your attention.